though scratched by something invisible. My grandfather was worried, but doctors found nothing wrong. They suggested it might be stress or some kind of allergy. But my mother knew there was more to it. She began to feel like she was being watched, as if someone, or something, was spying on her from the shadows. She could always feel Julia's cold gaze on her, almost as if she was enjoying Brenda's suffering. Her grandmother was the first to realize what was happening. One day she visited my mother and found her pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes and a lost expression. Her grandmother had a gift for sensing things, for seeing what others couldn't. The moment she stepped into Brenda's room, she knew there was something dark at play. "This is the work of witchcraft," she told my grandfather that very night. "Someone wants to harm Brenda." At first, my grandfather didn't want to believe it. He was a practical man who didn't put stock in such things. But Brenda's grandmother insisted. When they started searching the house, they found something that changed his mind. Behind a piece of furniture, hidden in a corner, they discovered a small fabric pouch. Inside, it contained strands of my mother's hair, rusty nails, and some kind of black powder. It was a witchcraft talisman, a spell meant to harm her. Her grandmother wasted no time. She packed a few things and took my mother to her village, far from Julia's influence. She knew of a healer there who could help, someone who understood such matters and could undo the evil that had been done. When the man saw my mother, he nodded slowly as if he already knew what was going on. "This is a strong spell. We'll need several cleansings," he said. Though scared, my mother agreed. She had nothing to lose and knew her grandmother wouldn't have brought her there without good reason. The cleansings began, one each night for 7 nights. The healer lit candles and burned herbs while reciting prayers and incantations. The first night, my mother felt immediate relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. But as the days went on, things grew more intense. By the 4th night, shadows began moving around the hut, as if something invisible was watching and surrounding them. My mother felt like something was trying to stop the ritual, resisting the undoing of the spell. The healer pressed on, undeterred, his voice growing stronger and more determined with each word. The 7th and final night was the worst. My mother recalls the air becoming tense and cold. The shadows grew more defined, taking on human-like shapes. Their faces were twisted with hatred and pain, writhing in the dim light. Screams filled the hut, voices that were not of this world, crying and wailing as if being torn from the place they belonged. The healer didn't falter. He continued the ritual with unwavering determination, chanting prayers and burning herbs until the shadows began to fade. The screams gradually turned into whispers, and then silence fell over the room. When the ritual was complete, my mother said she felt lighter, as if a heavy chain that had been wrapped around her soul had finally been broken. The healer instructed her grandmother to keep an eye on her and to cleanse the house when they returned, ensuring that no remnants of the dark energy remained. They did as he advised, and after a few weeks, my mother began to regain her strength. Her complexion improved and the nightmares stopped. She felt like herself again. When they returned home, Julia acted as though nothing had happened, but my mother noticed that she avoided her more than ever. It was as if Julia knew her spell had been broken and didn't dare to try again. Years later, my mother still doesn't understand why Julia harbored such hatred toward her, but she's convinced it was jealousy and fear of her overshadowing Letitia. Whatever the reason, my mother believes that the experience taught her the importance of faith, resilience, and the power of the unseen world. Even now, when she tells the story, there's a distant look in her eyes, as if part of her is still back in that dark time. But she survived, thanks to her grandmother's love and determination, and the guidance of a healer who wasn't afraid to confront the darkness. And I believe her. How could I not, after seeing the faint scars on her arms and the shadows that still flicker in her gaze when she talks about that time? There are things in this world that we may never fully understand, but one thing is certain. Evil exists, but so does the power to overcome it. The healer did not stop. He moved his hands over my mother's body, murmuring prayers as the smoke from the herbs filled the room. Suddenly, amidst all the chaos, an image formed in the smoke. My mother saw Julia's face, the stepmother, with a cruel smile and eyes full of hatred. "She's the one," my mother whispered, feeling fear and anger taking hold of her. The healer nodded but said nothing. He knew that the evil had originated from someone close, someone who had intended to harm her. But he also knew they were winning and that the spell was being broken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shadows vanished. The air cleared and my mother felt like she could breathe again. The weight that had been on her chest for months was gone. The healer finished the cleansing and my mother knew that at least for now she was safe. They returned to the village a few days later, and my mother stayed at my grandmother's house for a while. During those days Julia and Letitia seemed distant and nervous, as if they sensed that something was wrong. My mother avoided Julia but couldn't help noticing the worried look in her eyes. A week after the final cleansing, Julia's daughter suddenly died of a massive heart attack. No one saw it coming. She was a seemingly healthy young woman, and the news hit the family like a bomb. Julia withdrew into herself, unable to comprehend what had happened. My mother, though she never said it out loud, knew that something had been returned, that the witchcraft Julia had cast on her had turned back on her, targeting her own daughter. She felt no joy about it, only deep sadness and a sense that things would never be the same. Over time, Julia separated from my grandfather. The pain of losing her daughter consumed her, and she couldn't continue living in the same house where everything had happened. My mother eventually returned to her home, though with scars she would carry with her forever. She became a stronger and more cautious woman, and though she never spoke of what happened, she knew she would always carry the memory of that night of shadows. What she had seen, the screams and Julia's face forming in the smoke. It was a warning that told her witchcraft truly exists. The lost memory, there was always something in my grandfather's gaze when he looked at that old photograph. It was a black and white photo from the 1950s, showing a little boy with an innocent smile and a straw hat that was far too big for his head. My grandfather never talked much about his brother Arnolfo, and that photo was one of the few things left of him. But every time he looked at it, his eyes filled with a sadness I could never fully understand, until one day he finally decided to tell me the story. It was a rainy afternoon, and we were in my grandfather's house in Oaxaca, an old house full of memories and mysteries. Arnolfo's photo was framed on the mantel, and that afternoon as we watched the rain fall, my grandfather began to speak, almost as if he were talking to himself. "We were just kids," he said. "Arnolfo must have been about 6 years old, and we lived in a little village surrounded by mountains and forest. A beautiful place but also full of dangers." His voice was soft as if he were traveling back in time, reliving those childhood days. I stayed quiet, listening as my grandfather continued to recount the story he had carried with him his whole life. "Back then there were many stories about duendes," he went on. "The villagers said they were mischievous creatures that lived in the mountains and liked to take children. I always thought they were just tales to scare us, to keep us from wandering too far from home. But everything changed that day. It was a summer morning and my grandfather and Arnolfo were playing in the backyard. My grandfather's mother had warned them not to stray too far, but as children often do, curiosity got the better of them. They had heard about a stream running through the forest not far from their house. They decided to go look for it, and I remember everything seemed brighter and greener in those days. The forest felt like a magical place full of life. But as we went deeper, I began to feel like something wasn't right. It was as if the air grew heavier and the sounds of birds and insects faded away." He looked at his hands, which trembled slightly as he held them in his lap. Arnolfo was running ahead, laughing while I tried to keep up. Suddenly I saw him. He was staring at something among the trees and I approached. That's when I saw them. My grandfather paused and his voice lowered, as if sharing a secret that hadn't been told in years. They were small, about the size of a child, but they weren't children. They wore strange clothing and their eyes, those eyes were as dark as the night. They stared at us with curiosity, and although they didn't seem threatening, there was something about them that filled me with fear. The goblins began speaking among themselves in a language my grandfather couldn't understand. Somehow, though, he and Arnolfo understood that the creatures wanted to take them somewhere. It was as if an invisible force was drawing them forward. The two brothers began walking, following the goblins deeper into the forest. "I don't know how long we walked," he said. "Everything felt like a dream. The forest grew darker and the path became more confusing. I tried to stop. I tried to tell Arnolfo we should turn back, but it was like I couldn't speak, as if I couldn't move on my own." They reached a clearing in the forest, a place my grandfather had never seen before. The goblins stopped and formed a circle around them. Arnolfo was looking around with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening. And then everything changed. My grandfather felt a tug on his arm as if someone were pulling him back. He snapped back to reality and realized where he was. He grabbed Arnolfo's hand, but he wouldn't move. He was staring at the goblins as if hypnotized. My grandfather pulled with all his strength, but something was holding Arnolfo back. The goblins began to move closer and panic overtook my grandfather. He pulled with all his might, but in that moment, Arnolfo let go of his hand and moved further into the circle with the goblins. He called his name, shouted for him to come back, but Arnolfo didn't hear him. The goblins surrounded him and then he was gone, just like that. He simply disappeared. Silence filled the room as my grandfather stared at Arnolfo's photograph, as if he still couldn't believe what had happened. At that moment I ran back to the village crying and screaming. I told my parents and the neighbors what had happened, but no one believed me. They said Arnolfo had gotten lost in the forest and that everything else was just my imagination. They searched for days but never found him. They held a funeral for Arnolfo, though his body was never recovered. The adults spoke of accidents and the dangers of the forest. But my grandfather knew the truth. He knew the goblins had taken his brother and there was no way to get him back. I never went back into the forest. I never stopped thinking about him. Sometimes at night I dream of Arnolfo, his laughter and those damned goblins that took him. My mother always told me I had to let go, that I had to stop blaming myself. But how could I? I was the one who took him there. I was the one who lost him. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. I had always heard stories of goblins and magical beings, but I had never truly believed in them. Seeing my grandfather, seeing the pain in his face, I knew that, for him, it was as real as anything else. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, he finally said. If the goblins were just a way for my mind to cope with the loss. But deep down I know I saw them. I know there are things in this world we don't understand, things that live among us in the dark, forgotten corners. He looked at Arnolfo's photo one more time before getting up and placing it back on the shelf. He stood there, gazing out the window, lost in thought. I remained seated, trying to process what he had told me. I never asked about Arnolfo again after that, and my grandfather never spoke of it again. But every time I saw that photo, I knew his mind was back in the forest, with the goblins and the loss of his brother. Some stories don't need to be understood to be true, just like my grandfather's story.